June 3, 2014. The Computex stage in Taipei. A still somewhat green Lisa Su was representing an AMD that was on the verge of bankruptcy, sharing a blueprint for a dual x86 and ARM architecture. What she didn't know was that in just 4 months, she'd become CEO and inherit this massive dumpster fire. She also didn't know that almost every plan on that presentation, except for one tiny line of text, was doomed to fail. And she definitely didn't know that in just a few short years, she would personally pull AMD back from the brink of death, stomp all over Intel, and engineer the most unbelievable comeback in semiconductor history. Today, we're talking about the story of AMD CEO Lisa Su. People often mistake her appointment as CEO for a happy accident or a desperate gamble by a board out of options. But if you look back at the landscape in 2011, you'll realize this was a meticulously calculated 3-year master plan. The AMD board had a ton of problems, but they weren't just throwing things at the wall to see what stuck. They knew saving AMD took 2 steps. First, stop the bleeding. Second, generate new blood. Former CEO Rory Reid was the tourniquet. Coming from Lenovo, he was a master of operations and cost-cutting. His mission was crystal clear: stabilize this hemorrhaging company and keep it from dropping dead financially. By the time Lisa Su was poached to join AMD as Senior VP in 2012, the succession plan was already in motion. But the board needed one final test to see if this IBM-trained tech genius could actually survive the brutal reality of the corporate battlefield. This was Lisa Su's final exam: the console wars. At the time, AMD's PC business was getting slaughtered by Intel, and cash flow was practically zero. But Su spotted a hustle the big players turned their noses up at: semi-custom chips. She wanted to do the impossible: get bitter rivals Sony, PlayStation, and Microsoft, Xbox, to both use AMD chips. Cornering that market was basically a pipe dream, especially with Intel and Nvidia waiting in the wings. But Lisa Su showed them what execution looks like. Leading the charge herself, she constantly flew between Japan and Seattle. At the negotiating table, she didn't use empty corporate sales pitches. She brought out her inner engineer, drawing architecture diagrams right on the whiteboard to prove AMD could build them a custom chip that was both powerful and cheap. And the miracle happened. AMD bagged both the PS4 and the Xbox One. The profit margins weren't massive, but it brought in massive, stable cash flow. It was this lifeline that funded the R&D for the Zen architecture that would later turn AMD's fate around. This flawless victory completely won over the board. They knew Lisa Su wasn't just an engineer who understood circuit boards. She was an elite commander who could pull off a comeback in the most desperate of situations. In 2014, when Rory Reid finished his job of stopping the bleeding and stepped down, passing the baton to Lisa Su was the natural next step. It wasn't just a change in leadership. It was AMD switching from survival mode to all-out attack mode. To understand why Lisa Su can handle chaos so calmly, we have to look at her roots. Born in Tainan, Taiwan, she immigrated to the U.S. with her parents at age 3. Her father, Chunhui Su, was a statistician. Pay attention to that job title: statistician. In the Su household, you didn't argue with feelings or intuition. You used data and logic. Her dad's parenting style was classic Taiwanese, demanding not just good grades, but a specific way of thinking. Legend has it, he would hand young Lisa tough math problems to challenge her, telling her, "If you can solve this, you're better than the rest." This mindset, that solving the hardest problems is the ultimate proof of your worth, was hard-coded into Lisa Su's DNA. She eventually took that drive all the way to MIT, where she earned her PhD. She didn't just study there, she practically lived in the lab researching SOI technology, an incredibly dry and hardcore semiconductor manufacturing process. This experience was crucial, making her one of the very few tech CEOs who actually deeply understands the critical processes of chip manufacturing. By comparison, a lot of tech CEOs can't even tell you the difference between a nanometer and a micrometer. After graduating, she spent 13 years at IBM, climbing the ladder from researcher to VP of semiconductor R&D. She didn't just solve the copper wiring bottleneck that had plagued the industry. She learned how to take cutting-edge tech and actually execute it within a massive, often rigid, bureaucratic system. She then moved to Freescale as CTO. Compared to the deep pockets of IBM, Freescale was a mess of limited resources and chaotic product lines. This stint didn't just sharpen her technical vision, it taught her how to make ruthless trade-offs when resources were tight. When Lisa Su took over AMD in 2014, the company was on life support. Before she arrived, AMD had bet on the wrong future in 2011 with the Bulldozer CPU architecture. The chips ran hot, sucked power, and were absolutely crushed in performance by Intel's Sandy Bridge. AMD's market share in the highly lucrative server space nosedived from 25% to a dismal 0.8%. To make matters worse, they were dragging around over $2.2 billion in long-term debt. To scrape together some cash, they sold their Austin headquarters for $164 million and rented it back. To cut costs, they laid off nearly 30% of their staff in just a few years. Engineer morale was in the gutter, and talent was jumping ship left and right. The board thought it was over. Their biggest shareholder, the Mubadala Investment Company, just wanted to stop the bleeding, and even considered chopping the company up and selling it off for parts. No wonder AMD's stock plummeted to rock bottom, with its market cap shrinking to a pathetic $2 billion. After taking the reins in late 2014, Lisa Su made a ruthless decision. She slashed all non-essential spending and pushed all her chips to the center of the table, going all in on a high-performance core design, what would become the Zen architecture. The launch of Zen wasn't just a simple upgrade. It was a revolution that flipped the laws of semiconductor physics on its head. In the past, Intel chased performance by designing a single, massive, perfectly flawless chip, a monolithic design. It was like carving a giant diamond. There was zero room for error. One tiny chip, and the whole thing went in the trash. The costs were astronomical. Lisa Su broke the rules. She greenlit a crazy design concept called chiplets. Instead of carving one massive diamond, AMD built something more like Legos, gluing together smaller, cheaper chips using a tech called Infinity Fabric. Intel initially laughed it off as glued-together garbage. But they stopped laughing real quick, because this design sent AMD's yield rates through the roof and drove costs straight into the ground. Then came the bloodbath. In 2017, Lisa Su kicked down the door with the Ryzen series CPUs and completely flipped the table. For the exact same price that Intel would give you 4 cores, AMD gave you 8. Or you could get the same performance as Intel for half the price. At the same time, Su did the math. It didn't matter how good AMD's design was if it was bogged down by a terrible manufacturing process. They had to hitch a ride on TSMC's rocket ship. So, in 2016, she paid Global Foundries a $100 million breakup fee in cold, hard cash and embraced TSMC. And then, the historic crossover happened. AMD's Ryzen processors crushed Intel across the board in performance, power efficiency, and price. Intel could only watch helplessly as the money that used to be theirs flowed right into Lisa Su's pockets. But hold on. As badass as this sounds, we have to keep the history straight. AMD's meteoric rise is 50% thanks to Lisa Su, but the other 50% is due to Intel shooting itself in the foot. Between 2014 and 2020, Intel orchestrated the worst manufacturing stagnation in semiconductor history. Overconfident, Intel set an insanely aggressive 2.7 times density target for their 10-nanometer process, refused to use the EUV machines that TSMC was using, sticking stubbornly to older DUV tech, and got greedy by trying to use cobalt for wiring. This perfect storm of hubris resulted in Intel's infamous 6-year, 14-nanometer curse. Because their manufacturing process was stuck in the mud, Intel's design team was forced to keep slapping Band-Aids on the aging 2015 Skylake architecture. The reality was that their 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th generation CPUs were basically the exact same thing under the hood. Then, on February 15, 2022, history was made. AMD's market cap hit $197.7 billion, officially surpassing Intel's $197.2 billion. Lisa Su hadn't just rescued a penny stock that had once traded at $2. She had transformed AMD into a top-tier chip giant, practically worshipped by Wall Street. However, just as she was getting ready to pop the champagne, she looked up and realized the battlefield had shifted. The giant she had just beaten, Intel, was gasping for air on the floor. But an even bigger, much more terrifying shadow was looming over the entire tech industry. Her relative, Jensen Huang. It's Silicon Valley's favorite piece of gossip. AMD's Lisa Su and Nvidia's Jensen Huang are literally family. Specifically, Lisa Su's grandfather is the older brother of Jensen's mother, making him her uncle, or first cousin once removed. But this family reunion is anything but warm and fuzzy. While Su was busy dragging Intel through the mud in the CPU war, Huang's Nvidia was growing like a weed in the GPU and AI space. Then, ChatGPT dropped out of the sky in late 2022, and the world suddenly realized that the CPU was no longer the center of the universe. The GPU was. Now, Lisa Su has to pivot. And this time, her opponent isn't a stumbling Intel. It's an Nvidia at the absolute peak of its power, holding a 90% market share. People love calling her Su Ma, Mother Su. It sounds nurturing and kind, and combined with her soft-spoken tone and the smile she always wears at keynotes, it gives off serious room mom energy. But make no mistake, when it comes to business decisions, Lisa Su is utterly cold-blooded. If she needs something, she buys it. If someone is in her way, she cuts them out. When she realized AMD was lagging in the FPGA space, she didn't wait for her internal team to slowly figure it out. Without blinking, She dropped $35 billion in an all-stock deal to acquire Xilinx. That move instantly handed AMD the VIP pass to high-end data centers and edge computing. In 2024, racing to catch up with Nvidia and beef up server integration, she announced a $4.9 billion acquisition of ZT Systems, purely to poach their thousands of system design engineers. As for ZT Systems' manufacturing division, which pulls in billions in revenue, she opted to instantly chop it off and sell it. Then, she flexed her superpower again, gobbling up AI software companies like Nod.ai and Mipsology, instantly drafting hundreds of elite AI engineers into her main army. She has exactly one goal: do whatever it takes to catch up to Nvidia's CUDA software ecosystem. And the numbers show her strategy is working. AMD's 2025 full-year revenue smashed through $33 billion, hitting an all-time high in the company's 56-year history. Even crazier is their AI chip revenue. With the mass production of the MI325 and MI350 series, the AI division's revenue exploded from $4.5 billion last year to a staggering $12 billion. AMD's stock blasted past its previous highs, aggressively breaking the $250 barrier and pushing its market cap past $400 billion. Lisa Su is like Jensen Huang's shadow. He just can't shake her. She gives him zero room to breathe. The second Nvidia proves a direction is profitable, Lisa Su mobilizes the entire resources of AMD and charges right in. So let's kill the fantasy of a heartwarming family reunion. Sure, the media is dying for a photo op of Lisa Su and Jensen Huang hugging it out, slapping headlines on it like "The Pride of Taiwan" or "Family Glory." But the reality is that the next 10 years will be a brutal, bloody, zero-sum game forcing these distant relatives to tear each other apart. For Jensen Huang, when he's sitting in the dead of night and sees a new AMD press release drop, he isn't seeing a friendly greeting from a relative. He's seeing the little girl who grew up solving hardcore math problems, now holding a precision screwdriver, dismantling his throne piece by piece. That is Lisa Su, Nvidia's absolute worst nightmare for the next decade.